The first liberal Marxists, Marx and Engels. Adam Smith's ideas were widely received from 1776 to 1790, the year of his death, period in which 5 editions of his book were published. However, the liberal proposals were not going to be applied so easily. It took more than 70 years for that. With the repeal of the cereal laws in 1846, it was considered as the great triumph of the free trade ideas and the definitive victory of the industrial manufacturers against the landed aristocracy. Free trade ideas were gaining advances, gaining spaces and tribunes, such as political ascents of the liberal bourgeoisie, growing acceptance in the academic circles and through the application of economic policy. If we consider the year of 1846 as the end of trade protectionism, which England exercised with respect to foreign agricultural products, and from here other commodities were released giving natural channel to the development of industrial capitalism, then, protectionism as the basis of the mercantile system dominated, at least 2.5 centuries, according to Engels since the 17th century, or 3.5 according to Smith, from the emergence of the mercantile system in the 16th century. There are, in this period of about 3 centuries, different phases of capitalism. First, an incipient capitalism of commercial and artisanal type, still with a lot of feudal influence, which was developing towards manufacturing and small property capitalism. This type of capitalism, in turn, from the political and social revolutions, the religious and political reforms, the seizure of power by the bourgeoisie and the fundamental impulse of the Industrial Revolution, gave rise to industrial capitalism. In 1833, half a century after the establishment of big industry and when the current of industrial development had already found its normal channel. 26, says Engels. In September 1847 a Congress of economists, industrialists, merchants, parliamentarians, teachers, from England and other European countries was held in Brussels to deal with the problem of free trade. They discussed the benefits, its effects on the working class and the mechanisms for its spread in all countries, since some, such as France and Germany, they continued with protectionist measures. It was concluded, with almost unanimous approval, in favor of free trade and its benefits. It was at this economic congress that Marx spoke in favor of free trade, although for reasons different from the rest of the participants. In his speech, which was later read in January 1848 to the Democratic Society of Brussels, the repeal of the wheat laws of June 1846 meant the greatest triumph obtained by free trade in the 19th century, represented by the industrialists, the modern bourgeoisie. Marx defined free trade as the freedom of capital and sharply criticized the spokesman of hypocritical liberalism and of using arguments and demands such as cheap bread and high wages to win the support of the workers against the resistance of the landlords. He showed them with economic arguments that the direct beneficiary would be the bourgeoisie. But he noted that not criticizing the freedom of trade was his intention to come out in defense of the protectionist system. 27. In Capital, he defines it as follows: the protectionist system was an artificial means of manufacturing manufacturers, of expropriating independent workers, of capitalizing on national means of production and subsistence, of abbreviating by violence and the transition between the old and modern modes of production. Protectionism, together with the colonial system, public debts, taxes, and trade wars define them as offshoots of the manufacturing period, which had a gigantic growth during the childhood of big industry. 28. They were progressive methods in the sense that they contributed to the destruction of the feudal system and laid the foundations of capitalism. Engels says that protectionism was then the normal policy of any civilized country in Western Europe. 29. In the middle of the 19th century, Marx already considered protectionism as a conservative system. Engels will use the adjective superfluous while the free trade system defined it as revolutionary, because it acts destructively. It disintegrates the previous nationalities and culminates the antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In a word, the system of free trade accelerates the social revolution. Only in this revolutionary sense do I, gentlemen, cast my vote in favor of free trade. 30. Marx concluded his speech, not read, before the free traders. For Marx it was clear, and he repeatedly pointed it out, that capitalism was a revolutionary system of production and change, and that the industrial bourgeoisie was a revolutionary social class in relation to feudalism, as it had acted in the last century. Of Adam Smith he said that he had the language of the still revolutionary bourgeoisie, when he expressed his hatred against unproductive governments and clergy. 31. Referring to England, but valid for the world, Engels saw social development linked to the progress of industry, in such a way that all the institutions that hinder this progress, that limit it or try to regulate it and supervise it according to guidelines outside it, are reactionary institutions, unsustainable and necessarily called to fail in the face of the demands of this progressive state. 32. Protectionism and the absolutist state were reactionary institutions at that time, and any law or regulation that prevented the growth of the industrial sector, therefore of the industrial bourgeoisie, hindered social welfare. For Marx and Engels, commercial freedom constituted the natural and normal state of modern capitalist production, the economic means of putting into practice as soon as possible the conditions of this inevitable solution. 33. Only under free trade could the immense productive forces fully develop, and in this sense the already dominant bourgeoisie of political power had to promote capitalist progress, because its existence depended on it. In the Communist Manifesto of 1848 there is a resounding statement that remains fully valid: the bourgeoisie can exist only on condition that it incessantly revolutionizes the instruments of production and, consequently, the relations of production, and with it all social relations. 34. Marx says this at a time when free trade had citizenship in England, and the English bourgeoisie would strive to cross the borders of continental Europe with its heavy artillery, which were low-priced commodities, due in part to the abolition of tariffs on wheat and raw materials that had lowered wages and other components of constant capital. England, the workshop of the world, intended to radiate the new system to the civilized world. The capitalists were prepared to trade their commodities in exchange for letting in continental wheat. And what was the situation that the free traders said the working class would have? If raw materials were freely imported, the prices of manufactured goods would fall, which could be exported cheaper, and thus the production and demand for labor power would increase, which would increase wages and lower the price of workers' food products. Unemployment in one branch would be offset by occupation and investment in another. They were arguments for winning over the workers as allies in the struggle against the landlords. The English manufacturers were the ruling class, and their particular interests, for the time being, represented national interests. 35. Marx recognized that free trade, as proposed by the partisans, would effectively lead to the increase of the productive forces, to the increase of productive capital. The process of capitalist accumulation, the inversion of surplus value in productive capital, in constant and variable capital, leads to the increase of production and subsequently to the concentration and centralization of capital. This economic course, likewise, is the development of social relations, the growth of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The process is accompanied by competition among capitalists, which leads to the centralization of capital through the destruction of entrepreneurs. Also, it produces greater division of labor and use of machinery. The special skill of the worker is ended and qualified work is replaced by an activity that any worker can execute. Competition between the workers, the industrial reserve army, increases, and thus wages and living conditions decrease and the workload for all grows. Enormous productivity and overproduction of commodities lead to cyclical crises, decapitalization and unemployment, mergers, centralization, monopolization and the increase of the working population, and thus the process of capital accumulation continues. And, if this process occurs in a nation, then it is forced to continue developing from the world market, spurred on by the need to give more and more outlet to its products. The bourgeoisie travels the whole world. It needs to nest everywhere, settle everywhere, create bonds everywhere. 36. For Marx, although the feverish activity of capital was more favorable to the worker, In any case the situation of the workers was a dead end. If capital remains stationary, industry will not be stationary, but will retreat, and the first victim of it will be the worker. He will succumb before the capitalist. And if capital increases, that is, what is considered the most favorable case for the worker, what will be the fate of the worker? It will perish. 237 He knew that the development of the productive forces with free trade would lead to phases of animation, prosperity, and productive boom, but this would inevitably lead to a phase of crisis, of decline, and stagnation of production, which necessarily had to destroy the invested capital. It is destroyed to the extent that capital is inactive and by the decline in commodity prices. Only after this could the crisis phase be traced back and again continue as the natural change of the seasons. 38. Free trade and industrial development would lead to productive crises, always accompanied or preceded by commercial, monetary, and financial crises as an expression of the overproduction of commodities, which would become more frequent and more violent, more destructive of capital, which in the long run would develop the productive forces. It is a dialectical process of development, destruction, development of capital, in an upward spiral. From the above, Marx explained the British pauperism, and, therefore, that of any country, regardless of free trade or protectionism. Pauperism increases and decreases as the periods of stagnation and prosperity alternate. 39. Free trade led to a greater exploitation of the working class, to the extent that the productive forces and capital grew, being the most favorable condition, while protectionism, being unable to continue developing the economic system, did not develop the proletariat or bourgeoisie, maintained the obsolete structures of pre-industrial capitalism, and in this sense was an obstacle to development. Marx was a revolutionary who recognized and praised the impetus that free trade would give to capitalism, not because it brought profit to the workers, but because the development of the productive forces would lead to the expropriation of the expropriators, or as Engels says, it is well known that we do not sympathize with the bourgeoisie. But, this time, we sponsor his triumph, because his victory will give his definitive conformation to the world. And yet, nothing more evident than what they do is to open the way everywhere to us, to the Democrats and Communists. 40 To reach socialism one had to go through the development of industrial capitalism and the growth and organization of the communist proletariat. That was the approach of the classics of Marxism. 40 years after Marx had spoken out in favor of free trade, Engels wrote a foreword to the American edition of Protectionism and Free Trade, in which he takes up the fundamental principles and outlines the situation of both systems in Europe and the United States. From 1848 to 1866 there was an enormous boom in industry and commerce in England, largely due to the elimination of protective tariffs on raw materials and foodstuffs. Even the most exaggerated hopes of subsequent prosperity seemed to be fulfilled. 41 Contributing to this boom were the discoveries and exploitation of the gold mines of California and Australia, the world's largest increase in means of exchange, the development of means of transport such as rail and steamships. Countries, such as France, developed internally with protective tariffs and import bans. Switzerland was in total free trade and with a strong industrial development. Germany developed the industry with much more liberal tariffs than in other European countries. America protected itself with tariffs. The United States, in the 1880s, was discussing free trade, after remaining in protectionism beginning with the Civil War of 1861. For Engels it was necessary for the United States to become an industrial country so as not to be eternally condemned to barbarism and submission as an agricultural country. 15 years before writing the aforementioned prologue, he proposed the following alternative: for America to become an industrial country and have all the prospects, not only of reaching this path, but of defeating its rivals in it, it has two ways to follow, or, it maintains free trade, if you want, for 50 years, in a very costly fight of competition against English industry, which takes him about 100 years of advantage, or by means of protective tariffs, it discards English competition, say for 25 years, with the almost absolute certainty that, at the end of this same time, American industry will assert its place in the open world market. Engels believed that this last route was the most convenient, and by that time, at the end of the 25 years, he thought that protectionism should have done its work, to a greater or lesser extent, becoming a superfluous system, in such a way that if then it introduced free trade, I am sure that in 10 years it will have reached England on the world market. 42.